Well, hello. Here we are back with another video in our series on firearms and firearm safety. The previous videos um, have covered other specific guns. The first two videos in the series were specifically on introductory material and shooting safety, so you should watch those before watching the ones on specific guns because they contain important information that will help each of the other videos to make more sense. So in this video we're going to cover the two guns on the table in front of us, and those are called muzzle loading rifles. They're called muzzle loading rifles because they load from the muzzle end of the barrel instead of the breech end, as is done with most modern firearms. And um, contrary to modern firearms where you use a cartridge that holds all of the components of a given round of ammunition, these do not have a cartridge. Each of the components of a round of ammunition must be loaded into the gun individually, and so I will show you how that is done in a minute. Both of these guns have open sights. In fact, in most cases it's against the law to hunt with a muzzle loader that has a scope on it, so they will typically be found only with open sights. They also have a very specific type of action that is unique to muzzle loaders, in that there is a separate ignition source that is placed actually on the outside of the barrel that ignites the powder. So we'll go through each one of those things and show you how this is done. So to start off with, you need to take the gun, and I'm going to use just this one to demonstrate because it's the same for both of them. There is one difference that I will demonstrate between the two. But to start with, you simply take the gun and you stand it vertically. And the first thing that you do is you measure out some powder. And I don't have a stand to hold this, so I'll be fumbling just a little bit. But in this case, the powder flask is a specific type called a powder horn. For obvious reasons, it's made out of a cow horn. And I'm going to take the powder horn and I'm going to pour out a given amount of powder into the powder measure. Okay. This is a graduated cylinder, so it allows me to measure out exactly how much powder I want. There are powder measures that you can preset to only hold a certain amount. This one you simply have to watch the marks on the side of the cylinder. So there we have about 70 grains of powder, and the powder is simply a dark gray granular type of substance. I'm not going to actually load it, but at this point you would pour the powder down the barrel of the gun. Okay? And then you would tap the side of the barrel slightly to make sure all the powder drops down. And then you would put in the bullet. And there are several types of bullets that can be used with muzzle loaders. The most common type is just a round ball like I'm holding in my hand. That's used mostly for target shooting. The conical bullet that I have here is most commonly used for hunting, and it's about 3 times the weight of the round bullet, and so it's obvious why it would be used for hunting. It simply packs a lot more wallop. Here's another variety of a conical bullet. But at this point we want to put the bullet down the barrel, and if we're using a round ball like this one, would actually use also a patch. This is a pre-lubricated patch. It's placed over the end of the barrel. Okay. Then the bullet is placed in the middle of the patch, and the same device that we use to measure the powder also has a little protrusion called a short starter. So what we do at that point is place the short starter on the bullet and then hit that with the hand to start the bullet down the barrel. Now I'm not going to actually do this because at that point we would have a loaded firearm, and the only way to unload a muzzle loader is to fire it, and I don't want to do that. But once you've started down the barrel with the short starter, then you would take the ramrod and put that on top of the bullet and just push that all the way down till it reaches the bottom of the barrel. You'd make sure it's down there good and firm because you want the powder compacted fairly tightly. If it's not compacted tightly, you won't get the even kind of burning that you want for a good powerful shot. So once the bullet is pressed down and firmly packed down, then you put the ramrod back in place below the barrel of the gun. I should mention that in many cases in range shooting you won't actually use the ramrod that is with the gun. You use a range rod that you don't place in the gun. It just makes it a little bit easier. Okay, so now we have the powder and the bullet inside the gun, and the other thing that needs to be done is to put on a percussion cap. And I'll show this. Here's a little tin of percussion caps. It's just a very small item, but that's what provides the ignition to the gunpowder inside the chamber of the gun. So usually you don't put those on by hand just because they're so small. I have a device here called a capper, and you use that by filling it up with caps in advance. They go through this little hole here, and you push one out to the end of the capper, and then you use the capper to put the cap on the nipple of the gun. You first have to pull the hammer back, and then use the capper to place the cap on that nipple, which I'm not going to do. Okay, and at that point the gun is loaded and ready to fire. Okay, and pulling the trigger will release the hammer. The hammer comes down, hits the percussion cap. The percussion cap sends a flame through the nipple into the breech of the gun, ignites the powder, and it goes bang, and then the bullet comes out the other end. So it works the same way as a modern firearm, except that you simply have to load it one piece at a time rather than just loading in a cartridge. Now there are two differences, just one difference between these two guns that I'll explain. If you look at this one, you'll see it has just one trigger. If you look at this one, you'll see it has two triggers. And the purpose for that, the front trigger is what actually releases the hammer and fires the gun. The rear trigger is what's called the set trigger. And once the hammer is back, pulling the set trigger actually decreases the sensitivity of the front trigger, so you have to pull it not quite as hard to fire the gun. A lot of people like to use that when they're hunting just because it allows them a little bit more control when they're actually firing at a big game animal. Now these two guns, as I said, are pretty much identical, except for the second trigger that I pointed out. They also are of slightly different calibers. I'm going to show you the muzzle end of this one. This is a 54 caliber muzzle loader, so it's quite a large bore, a little over 1/2 inch in diameter. And the other one is a 45 caliber. So I'll hold that up and you can see the bore. Still a pretty good sized bore, but not quite as big as the other one. Both of them do pack quite a wallop, although not nearly as much as a modern rifle of the same caliber would pack. Now I should mention also that there is no easy way to unload a muzzle loader once it's been loaded other than to fire it. There are devices that you can use to do that. One of the most common is a screw tip that you can put onto the end of your ramrod, which allows you to screw it into the bullet and then pull it out. The other is a gas operated device that you can put on the nipple of the gun and just use a compressed gas to blow the load out of a gun that has been loaded but you don't wish to fire. But in most cases, someone who has a loaded muzzle loader and wants it to be unloaded will simply point it in a safe direction, typically into the ground, and then discharge the gun. That's the easiest way and probably the most common way. Now let me look at my checklist to make sure that I haven't forgotten anything. Oh yes, there is one thing I forgot. On a muzzle loader there is a safety device. I've talked about safeties in other videos, and I encourage people not to rely on the safety simply because it's a mechanical device that can fail, but instead to rely on their own good habits of safe firearm handling. But I will show you the safety on these guns. The safety is simply the half-cocked position of the hammer. So you pull that back to the first click. That's now in a safe position, and the trigger cannot be pulled. You have to pull the trigger or pull the hammer back all the way before you can pull the trigger, as I'm going to do right here. So I think that's it for muzzle loaders. Just imparting one comment, you'll often hear these guns called black powder guns. That's a common term, but technically it's not correct, because black powder is only one of several powders that can be used in here. It's actually not used very commonly anymore, simply because it's chemically less stable than some of the more modern muzzle loading propellants, and it's harder to get and more expensive. So most people use propellants other than black powder. The most common one is one called Pyrodex, which is what I'm using here. So I think that's it. So I'm going to shut off the camera. We'll see you on another video.